Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a Chief Compliance Officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
My guest this month on The Compliance Life is Matt Silverman. Matt is not a Chief Compliance Officer, but a Director of Trade Compliance at VIAVI. I thought it would be interesting to explore the journey to the director's seat for a trade compliance professional, as it mirrors the journey of a Chief Compliance Officer, but also has some unique twists and turns. So over this 4-part podcast series in the month of December of 2021, we're going to be exploring Matt's journey, his academic background, his move from private practice to the corporate world, and then some of the unique challenges of a Director of Trade Compliance. I know you'll enjoy this month on The Compliance Life featuring Matt Silverman. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to a new edition of The Compliance Life. In the month of December, I'm going to be visiting with Matt Silverman. Matt is currently a Director of Trade Compliance. He is our first non-anti-corruption compliance type on The Compliance Life, but I found his story really interesting, and I thought it would be even more interesting to have a non-ABC compliance professional come in and tell us about his journey to and from the chair. So, Matt, first of all, welcome to The Compliance Life.
Thank you, Tom. Very, very happy to be here. Happy to accept your invitation to talk with you for a little bit today. I appreciate it.
So, Matt, I was wondering if you could start with telling us about your academic background and your early professional career.
Yeah, so I am a proud graduate of the University of Michigan, go Blue, and then from there went straight on to a law career. I went to law school at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. I'm from the Chicago area. I shortly after that began practicing as a litigator in Chicago. So I did a somewhat broad array of things, but always kind of concentrated in the defense litigation field. So some medical malpractice, personal injury, some employment law here and there. I did a lot of asbestos litigation, which for those who have ever practiced in that area or know people that have, it can be somewhat monotonous and a lot of the same kind of cases that you're seeing kind of over and over again, slightly different fact patterns maybe, but really the same cases over and over again. And I did that for a while and really got to a point where I felt a little bit pigeonholed in my career, that I certainly could have continued on as a litigator and probably an asbestos litigator, but I didn't really want to do that with my career. It's not really what I wanted to do as an attorney. I still know plenty of people who practice in that area, and there's certainly the ability to gain a lot of good experience and become a good trial lawyer, but I didn't really see that as an opportunity for myself. So I took a somewhat probably non-traditional path, at least for a U.S. attorney, and I got my LLM at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I had known some people who had gone there to get a tax LLM, which is more common for tax attorneys, not as common for compliance attorneys or international trade attorneys. But I kind of used the LLM as a bit of a springboard in my career to kind of transition my career from being a litigator to being a international trade. I had hoped one day attorney. I wasn't really sure exactly what I would do with it, but I went to Georgetown, and then during my LLM program, I got to get really involved with the kind of policy and legislation side of things in trade compliance. So I worked on Capitol Hill for a little while as an extern. Working for a U.S. senator on trade policy and legislation. I worked as part of the Obama administration with the U.S. Trade Representative, who, for those who aren't familiar, the USTR, they do a lot of things on the policy side, one of which is negotiating free trade agreements, things like that. So I got to work within the USTR, and also got to work at a law firm within their international trade group, and got to work on a lot of interesting anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases for those non-trade professionals. I won't go into that in detail, but it can be a very interesting area to work in, and I got really good experience. So both on the kind of private corporate regulatory side, as well more on the government public affairs side, and really enjoyed that work, and obviously really enjoyed my academic time at Georgetown, and use that, like I said, as a bit of a springboard to kind of start somewhat fresh as a newly trained international trade attorney coming out of Georgetown, kind of putting my litigation past behind me, although I still use it every now and again in terms of research and writing. But I really used my new degree to kind of springboard me into a different professional career.
So, Matt, let me explore your international business law degree at Georgetown. Could you maybe contrast it with your law school academic experience? Was it the same? Was it different? And how did that really help you, in your mind, prepare to move to a different field within the law of trade compliance?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There are certainly some similarities between a JD and an LLM, but I would say that the big difference is obviously within an LLM, you are going into it with a very specific idea of what you want to study, or at least you think you know what you want to study. So you can really be a lot more picky in terms of the courses that you take. So I really, in my LLM program, focused almost exclusively on trade compliance courses. And now you can't do that at every school with an LLM, but at a school like Georgetown in Washington, D.C., they have a lot of trade policy, black letter law courses that you can take. You'd maybe be surprised how many. And they had a whole curriculum just focused on international trade compliance, which obviously can include the export side, import side, sanctions issues, and then, like I said, more of the kind of policy issues and free trade agreements and things like that. So the LLM was very focused on international trade. The JD, uh, like most JD programs, at least in the first year or two, much broader, right? So everything from torts and criminal law and civil procedure to more focused courses that I could pick and choose from. But I took everything, in my JD, from employment law and child law to different types of clinics and things like that looked interesting to me. So the JD was much more broadly focused. When I got out of my JD program, I did become a defense litigator, but not because I had really necessarily been trained to do that. Most of my training really occurred on the job. By the time I had gotten my LLM and gone through that program, though, I had a much better idea of what the substantive nature of international trade was, what it would be to really be a international trade compliance professional or attorney. It was much more focused. So I certainly wouldn't go back and do it differently. Having a kind of a general background that you get as a lawyer, having a JD both in research and writing and evidence and civil procedure. I mean, that's all obviously very important. And there are a lot of parts of it, both in my academic background and my professional background, that have been helpful as a corporate regulatory attorney. But yeah, the LLM was much more specific and really gave me an opportunity to delve much deeper into an area of law and compliance where I knew I had interest, but didn't really know until after I had completed that degree that this is really something I could see doing for my career.
And let me ask you a little bit about some of the policy aspects. As you know, as I introduced, you're the first trade compliance director of trade compliance on the Compliance Life, and I really only know one other person who's moved into compliance, even if it was ABC compliance, but starting really the way you did with the same degree at Georgetown and then doing policy work on the Hill or other places. How did the policy work you did, even as an extern, really help you in your career going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think part of it is that obviously when you are what I do now as a trade attorney in the corporate field, it's not necessarily policy that you're interested in. I mean, you may have an interest in it, but it's not really what you're concerned about day to day. Your concerns are, for the most part, the black letter law, for lack of a better term, how to apply it, what it is, where it's changing, et cetera. But being involved on the policy side, right? Getting to work with the different agencies, for example, when they were negotiating free trade agreements, or getting a really good understanding of the role of OFAC within the Treasury Department or the role of Commerce, and seeing how the laws, so for example, the Export Administration Regulations, or within the Department of State, the USML, how these different laws and regulations really come to be negotiated, who are kind of the key players, whether they're lobbyists or other businesses who have interests to ensure that the laws are written a certain way. It's kind of nice to see how the kind of see how the sausage is made, right? To kind of see the inner workings of these laws and regulations, how they come to be, the different stakeholders and parties involved, and then getting to work, literally on the Hill with a U.S. senator and his team on how they kind of weigh the different interests, right? The interests of their constituents, the interests of certainly of corporations and other companies, whether it's within their constituency or just U.S. companies overall, and how certain laws or regulations will impact them. It gives you, I think, a better idea once you become a professional in the private sector. It gives you a better understanding and more involvement in not just how are we going to apply this law or what is the law, but it really does help you to see how some of these regulations come about. And even in my career in the private sector and representing companies, policy does come into play. I mean, we have public affairs at my current job and previous positions. We have people who work in government affairs in Washington, D.C., who we have to coordinate with if we're concerned or need clarification about maybe an upcoming change to the regulatory environment, and we want to protect our interests as a telecommunication company, or in my previous jobs as a in the semiconductor industry. So, I also work with our government affairs people, and having that background, having that knowledge, and seeing a little bit how things work on Capitol Hill, it does help you to appreciate that more, and have a better working relationship with your government affairs people on the inside.
Matt, one of the places you worked as an extern, I believe, was the World Bank, and I frankly was not aware of the World Bank or had not thought of them in terms of trade compliance. But could you give a few words about the World Bank's role in trade compliance and how that may actually also influence your work right up to today?
Sure. So I did a very kind of a very specific job at the World Bank. So the World Bank is not really thought of as a trade compliance agency necessarily, and it's not. But one of the things that the World Bank does is foreign direct investment, right? So investing in it could be small companies or family-run businesses or large corporations outside of the United States. Putting money directly into those investments. It could be helping, a small community in Kenya who's got a coffee bean company, a startup, investing in them, or it could be something much larger scale. So what I did in that job was I worked specifically on foreign direct investment issues in an area of the World Bank called the International Finance Corporation, which sounds like a private institution, but it's not. It's part of the World Bank. And basically, what I did there was taking a look at different countries and what some of the investments risks and liabilities were from a U.S. standpoint. So if we decided to invest in a company in Sweden, in Kenya, in Russia, et cetera, what are some of the risks involved? How do we mitigate against such risks? Whether it's political strife or civil unrest or earthquakes or hurricanes or all different kinds of things, or just corruption within the government. So it was a really interesting opportunity. It wasn't necessarily trade compliance directly, but certainly in my position now, where I focus on things like due diligence within the trade compliance field and who we're investing in or what companies we're thinking of purchasing, things like that, where you have to balance some of those risks and liabilities and how do you mitigate those. It gave me, I think, a good understanding of that, and it was really, it's not something I use every day, but certainly being able to analyze risk is a big part of my job as a trade compliance professional. And so that job at the World Bank gave me a good opportunity to look at literally across the world, different countries, different companies, what the risks are involved in that case with foreign direct investment issues.
So, Matt, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us in our next episode, which will be episode 2, where you move into the corporate world. Matt, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.